one of the problems with autistic people, and they have a very difficult time developing language, by the way, is that they can't abstract out generalized representation across a set of entities. They can't abstract. And then and of course, if you can't abstract, then it's also very difficult to manipulate the abstractions. And you see very strange behavior with autistic children, for example. So they don't like people. And that's because people don't stay in their perceptual boxes. Like a human being is a very difficult thing to perceive because we're always shifting around and moving and doing different things. Like we don't stay in our categorical box. So autistic people have real trouble with other people. But they also have trouble. So for example, if your autistic child gets accustomed to your kitchen, let's say, and you move a chair, then especially if they're severely autistic, they'll have an absolute fit about it. Because you think kitchen with chair moved. They think completely different place. Because they can't abstract the constancies across the different situations and represent them abstractly. So I made this little diagram. I made this little diagram here to kind of give you a sense of what you might be doing when you're abstracting perceptually. And so you could say, think about something that's that complicated. It's sort of my model of how complex the world is, but the world is a lot more complex than that. But the world is made out of, everything is made out of littler things, and those littler things are made out of littler things, and so forth. And those things are nested inside bigger things, and so forth. And where you perceive on that level of abstraction is somewhat arbitrary. It has to be bounded by your goals. That's the other thing, is that your perceptual structures are determined by the goals that you have at hand. I mean, some of that's not completely true, because your perceptual systems also have limitations, right? There's things you can't see or hear even if you need to. So there are limitations built in, but within that set of limitations, you're still trying to tune your perceptions to your motivated goals. And that's also very useful to think about when you're trying to understand artificial intelligence, because for human beings, without goals, there's no perception. Because there's no filtering mechanism that you can use to determine the level of resolution at which you perceive. Anyway, so there's a thing made of smaller things which are made out of smaller things. And it's kind of my iconic representation of the complexity of the world. And then you could think, well, what is this? How can you see this object? And I think if you just look at it, you can detect, it's like a Necker cube, you know, those cubes that are line drawings that you can see the front of and then it'll flip to the back. Have you seen those? So this is kind of Necker cube-like, or at least it is for me, in that when I look at it, my perceptions play around with it. Sometimes I focus on the kind of cross-like shape in the middle, and sometimes I can see these other lines, and then sometimes I'll focus on that square, and sometimes I can see the little dots there, or maybe one dot, and my perceptions are going like this, trying to fit a pattern to it. And you can kind of detect that when you're watching it. And so I would say, well, you have the options of perceiving this in its full complexity, or you can simplify it. Essentially, there's lots of ways you can simplify it, but some of them are laid out there. So you take the complex thing, you make a low resolution representation of it. So that's the rough area that all those dots occupy. That's the rough area broken down to its 4 most fundamental quadrants. That might be how you would look at it if this was a map of an orchard and you were trying to walk from south to north. That would be a useful representation. This combines this and this. That's that's the highest level of resolution that you can perceive this object at. That's lower resolution than the object itself. So the first issue is, how should you look at things? Well, that's a problem that intelligence has to solve. So that's one of the problems that intelligence goes after. And then I think what happens is we have the thing in itself, and then we simplify it with a perception, and that's like an iconic representation, and then we nail the iconic representation with a word. And that's how we compress the world's complexity into something that we can manage. We take the complex thing, make it into an icon, and represent the icon with a word. And then when I throw you the word, so to speak, you decompose it into the icon and then decompose it even further into the thing, if you know the icon and you know the thing. And so then we can use shorthand, right? Because you have representational structures and so do I, and I'm just tossing you markers about your representational structures and you can unfold them. That's what you do when you're reading a novel. Because the novel comes alive in your imagination in your own idiosyncratic way. And it wouldn't if you didn't understand the references of the novel, right? The novelist has to assume that your basic perceptual structures and your intuitions and your instincts are basically the same as his or hers, because otherwise they have to assume that, because otherwise they would be lost in an infinite regressive explanation. So, and it's problematic often. For example, if you start reading Victorian novels, you may find that it takes a while to get into them because the presuppositions, the expectations are slightly different, and so is the language. You have to update the representations. But anyway, so that's roughly, as far as I'm concerned, that's roughly a representation of what intelligence is doing in the world. It's, or a big part of it. It's how in the world do you look at things so that you can use them for the purposes that you need to use them for. And then the next problem that intelligence has to solve, which is related, is once you've got the perceptual landscape sorted out, how do you abstractly represent the action patterns that you're going to implement in the world? So it's, how do you perceive where you are now? How do you perceive where you're going? And how do you construct up and then implement strategies that enable you to move from where you are to where you're going? So it's a continual process of mapping and movement. And so it's navigation. That's what we're doing in the world all the time, is navigating through it, because we're mobile creatures. We're navigating through it, attempting to make the world manifest itself in accordance with our wishes. And that's the fundamental problem that intelligence has to solve. And animals have their perceptions to rely on, but we have our perceptions and our ability to abstract from those perceptions multiple times, and then to abstract finally into language. So we live in a very abstracted world. And it also means that we can learn a lesson in one place and generalize it across many other places, which is also something that animals have a hard time doing, because they don't know how to do that initial perceptual generalization.